Good afternoon. Welcome to another edition of our virtual alumni speaker series. My name is Brandon Haberjack, class of 2006, and I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement and Giving at Central Catholic. Joining us today, we have Dr. Ed Scott, who will be sharing a presentation entitled Building Interpersonal Relationships While Respecting Our Differences. What does perspective taking have to do with it? Dr. Scott is Associate Professor of Accounting at Slippery Rock University. His education includes a Ph.D. in Business Administration from Oklahoma State University, an MBA from Texas Christian University, and a Bachelor's of Science in Accounting from Point Park University. His research interests include minority retention in professional service organizations, audit team performance, and college and career success for first-generation college students. He has presented his research at the annual conferences of the American Accounting Association, Academy of Management, and the International Association for Conflict Management. He has received 2 Best Conference Paper Awards and has published in the CPA Journal and the Journal of Business Diversity. He's a certified public accountant. His professional experience includes 5 years as an auditor with Deloitte, 3 years with the City of Pittsburgh Urban Redevelopment and Housing Authorities, and 13 years in the transportation industry, where he's held managerial and executive positions. Without further ado, I would now like to introduce Dr. Ed Scott. Dr. Scott, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. Thanks to Central for inviting me. Good afternoon, my Central brethren and all members of the Central Catholic community. I'd like to introduce you to some very special people. The wonderful lady to the far left in the picture is my mom, Mary Scott. I want to thank you, Mom, for the love and support you continuously give our family. My mom and dad moved to Pittsburgh in 1970 when she got her first corporate job, in Pittsburgh, at the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad. I remember when the P&LE Railroad went out of business, and my mom had to make a career change. She decided to earn her bachelor's degree at Point Park College, and she started a new career with American Airlines. What I remember most about my mom at that time was the strength she showed as she worked hard to make it through a career change. As we say today, to reinvent yourself, right? So she moved on to a rewarding career in human resources. And she loved the railroad gig, but who would have thought that her son would have spent the last 15 years of his corporate career working for a railroad company. So life is really interesting. The distinguished gentleman next to her is my dad, Charles Scott. My dad earned his undergraduate degree at Morehouse College in Atlanta University. Like Central, Morehouse is an all-male, historically Black college. My dad is the epitome of an excellent educator. I remember asking him one day why he didn't teach full-time at the college level. And he said, I teach where I teach because I like helping slow learners. That statement's always stuck with me because it represents what education is all about. So between us stands Patricia Scott, my wife for 27 years. She recently completed her Ph.D. in nursing at Duquesne University, and I'm very proud of her accomplishments. She was selected by Duquesne to speak at commencement on behalf of the graduate students. She's also on the front lines caring for veterans during this pandemic. And there's one other family member that's not in there is my sister Charlena. She is a nurse also up in Harrisburg. She graduated from Penn State, and she's also on those front lines. So in this picture is my son. I love Central because of my experience as a student, but I love Central even more as a parent. As a family, we moved around the country quite a bit due to different corporate jobs, and our son was never in one school for more than 2 or 3 years. So consequently, we had our fair share of adjustment issues at various schools. But I'll say that God provided us an opportunity to move back to Pittsburgh when our son was graduating from 8th grade. And I had competing job officers at that time, I remember. And what tipped the scale in favor of us returning to Pittsburgh was the opportunity for our son to go to Central. I remember the first day at Central, at new freshman orientation with Ed Jr., and we ran into Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown was my business math teacher when I was at Central. Mr. Brown recognized me immediately and he shouted, "Eddie Scott." I smiled at him and we shook hands, and he asked me, he said, "Who's this young man?" I said, "This is my son." And Mr. Brown looked at Junior and he smiled and said, "We know all about you." Um, Ed Jr. Is a Dean's List senior accounting major at Slippery Rock, and I couldn't be more prouder of him. Central was the first school Junior attended where where we were never concerned about his chance to succeed. Even when we experienced some bumps in the road, Central helped us to grow as a family, and for Junior myself as a tighter father-son relationship. So thank you, Mr. Brown, and the wonderful staff and faculty who delivered that Central experience. So my hope for us today is to have a helpful conversation about how we might improve interpersonal relationships through perspective taking. I did not learn about the academic meaning of perspective taking until my doctoral studies. But frankly, you don't need a PhD to know that treating someone like you want to be treated is the golden rule of relationships, right? But in this world of big data and algorithms, the importance of science to fight a lethal virus, findings from academic studies help us to understand why we behave the way we do, particularly why we value each other differently based on racial, ethnic background or country of origin. I chose to talk about perspective taking today for several reasons. When I left for spring break in March 2020, I had no idea that I would not teach students in person until September 2021. I had no idea that on May 25th, 2020, for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, I would watch a man die on national TV under the knee of a police officer. I had no idea that on January 6, 2021, the US Capitol building would be overrun with people intent on harming members of both political parties. I had no idea that as of March 11th, 2021, a year from the date America went into lockdown, that President Biden would tell us that 527,726 people would have died from the COVID-19. I had no idea that I would publish an article in the CPA journal about how white supervisors can improve their relationships with African-American coworkers by using perspective taking. And I had no idea that I would have the honor of speaking with my Central brethren today. I join you in this conversation by standing on the virtual common ground of Pittsburgh Central Catholic. I entered the doors of this academic institution in August 1979. The first year was hard, mainly C's and D's, and an F that sent me to summer school, where my dad, patiently tutored me in geometry. My second year was not off to a good start either, so Dad cut a deal with a streetwise guy from Miami, Florida. See, my dad was working on his Ph.D. At the University of Pittsburgh, and he decided to take a statistics course as an elective, right? So he was taking a course as a statistics class as just an elective. A classmate in that course was struggling, and my dad and the guy made a deal, right? The deal was that my dad would tutor him in statistics, and this guy would tutor me in some of the hard lessons of life. His name was Lonnie Parker. He was a janitor, a preacher, a salesman, entrepreneur, And as he likes to refer to him, just a po' boy from Florida. So one day, I was in my backyard and I was just shooting some hoops, and Parker showed up and said, "Check it out." I'd never seen him before, but he seemed pretty decent. He seemed pretty cool. So we played, and I remember I lost something like 10-2. But after the game, he said, "I know your dad." He said, "What are you doing this weekend?" I said, "Nothing." So he said, "Come over to my house on Saturday. Be there by 7 a.m." So when I got there on Saturday, he opened the door. He was in his bathrobe, and he sent me to the garage, right, immediately to wash and wax, his two cars, right. And then after that, I had to cut the grass. So around 10:30, I told him I was done, right. So we ate breakfast, and then he said, "Let's go to work." I'm like, "Let's go to work." We just worked, or I just worked, right? So that Saturday, we cleaned bathrooms and floors at like several legal offices that he had contracts with. And then we moved office furniture, around the city. So we got back to his house around 8 a.m. I'm sorry, around 8 p.m. And I was waiting to get paid, right? So he gave me $5, and he said, "You did okay. I'll see you next Saturday." So I was fired up, man. I was like, $5, that's it. And then I had to catch the bus back home. But I calmed down, because then back then, lunches were pretty cheap at Central, so I had lunch for 2 days. And for the next few years, while I was in high school, I worked with Lonnie Parker quite a bit. It's about almost just about every weekend. And I'll tell you that for the last 41 years, he's been my mentor and friend. Um, I distinctly remember one Saturday, we were riding back to his house. It was Pittsburgh. It was cold. It was snowing. We had worked all day. I was tired, and he knew it was the right time, right, to ask me this question. So he looked at me and he says, "So what do you want to do?" So I looked at him, puzzled, and I said, "I don't know." All I knew at that point, I was tired, right? He said, "Boy, can you read?" I said, "Yeah," indignantly, right? He said, "Can you write?" I said, "I can write." He said, "Can you count?" So I just stared at him, and he said, I, I can count to three. So I'm just staring at him now. I'm getting mad. And he said, "You should be an accountant." So I just kept staring at him. He said, "The reason I'm in this stats class with your dad is that I'm working, right, on a certificate in accounting, because I need to learn how to keep the books for my businesses." And he says, "If you become an accountant, you'll always have a job." So now, right, I'm thinking, while I'm staring. Um, so there were two other significant influences on my decision to major in accounting. Um, William Williams and Kevin Mccorkle. They were both Central grads. Billy Williams, AKA Toot, he was 2 years ahead of me. And Kevin was 1 year ahead of me. And I didn't know Toot personally, right? Maybe said hi to him once or twice, but I admired him, right? He was a star athlete. He was academically tight, always dressed well. And while at Central, he had an accounting internship at Consolidated Natural Gas. So even as a high school student, he was working, on an accounting internship at a corporation. I wanted to be like him, right? Kevin and I were from the Hill District, and we became friends during my junior year on the football team. Kevin was a starting defensive back. He was a great football player. He's always dressed nice too. And he was going to IUP to play football and to major in accounting. So I also wanted to be like Kev. So I went to IUP. I majored in accounting, but notice I did not say I played football. So trust me, we're getting to perspective taking. I played football my freshman, junior, and senior year. And as some of you might know, before the season starts, we have a 2-week summer camp. And during summer camp, the coaches decide who starts and who does not. So we had finished 1 week of summer camp, and I was at the end of that week first week of camp, I was the starting defensive back for the same position that my friend Kevin played. And I remember, so during the middle of the second week of camp, my position coach called the names of the first team players for a scrimmage, right? My name wasn't called. So I had been starting, and then all of a sudden my name wasn't called. My position coach called the name of a player who joined the team at the beginning of the second week of camp. So this particular person, he and his brother had just transferred to Central from another private school in the area. So later that day, right after practice, really, I walked up to my coach, and I asked him why I wasn't starting. I told my coach, I said, I'm just as good as him. And my coach said to me, "That's just it, Eddie. You're just as good." So I didn't know what to say, what to think. I considered quitting the team. But after the third game of the season, I wound up starting the rest of the season due to an injury to another player. And the guy that had taken my position replaced the guy who got injured. But I have a question for you. If two guys are just as good as each other, what is the reason one guy starts and the other guy doesn't? So we'll come back to that question a little bit later. After the season was over, my position coach asked me, so where was I planning to go to college? So I told him, I said, I'm going to IUP, I'm going following Kev. Interestingly, he volunteered to drive me to IUP to introduce me to the head coach in hopes of helping me get on the team. I accepted his offer. However, I decided not to play football at IUP. Looking back on that experience and putting myself in my position coach's shoes, in other words, doing a little perspective taking, I do not think it was his decision regarding which player was going to start. But the question remains, why does one guy start and the other doesn't if they're both equal in ability? So my experience at IUP was not good. And I had to leave after my sophomore year due to failing grades. So my Central brothers, I had to get myself together. So I joined the Marine Corps Reserves to earn money to help pay for college. And when I was done with boot camp, I returned home and transferred from IUP to Point Park College. I went to Point Park on a part-time basis and worked at Hannes Wagner Company until I could afford to go to school full-time. And by the way, to my mother and father, thank you for letting me live at the house rent-free while I got through that particular phase of my life. And thanks, Dad, for teaching at Point Park. Because however many courses my dad taught, I could take those credits for free. You guys remember Hannes Wagner Company? It was a really cool downtown store on Forbes Avenue. And anything you wanted related to sports, you could buy there. That job for me was a gift from God. And one of my duties at Hannes Wagner was to put your favorite player's name and number, like on your favorite Steelers or Pirates or Penguins jersey, whatever professional team you like, or college team. So there's one day, a guy who I had never met before came into the store. He picked out a jersey, gave it to me, and told me what he wanted on the jersey. His name was Mr. Gavin. He's a white dude, like late 30s. So Mr. Gavin's watching me work on his jersey, and he asked me, so what do you do? So I thought it was a strange question, because I'm like, I'm working in the store, I'm making his jersey. It's like, what does it look like I do, right? So he follows up with, are you in school? I said, yeah, Point Park. He asked, me, so what's your major? I said, accounting. He said, so what's your GPA? I said, a 3.0. So he said, my wife works for Westinghouse Electric Company, and she's looking for summer interns. Um, he gave me his contact info and told me to send him my resume. So that summer I worked as an accounting intern at Westinghouse, right? And that gave me all the confidence in the world to finish my degree, and to start working for Touche Ross and Company, a public accounting firm. So now remember, folks, I didn't know Mr. Gavin from a can of paint. So why did he choose to communicate with me, to value me by asking those questions, with the specific intent to help me? Was he perspective taking in some way? In other words, was he wondering what it might be like to be a student, a Black student in Pittsburgh, PA, trying to ultimately get an entry-level professional job in accounting? All right, so before I leave my college years, right, and move on to the academic definition of perspective taking, I want to introduce you to Ron Halsack. Ron was my business strategy professor during my last semester at Point Park. Ron was a good racquetball player, expensive cigar smoker, an outspoken, burly Italian. He had an old school teaching method. He wrote everything he knew on the board about strategy, right, from one end of the blackboard to the other. And he repeated that activity the entire 3 hours of our evening class, right? And so your job on the exam was to bring a legal pad or two and some pencils, right, and write down everything he wrote on the board the last 8 weeks, right, of class. Okay. So I wound up getting an A in his course, right? And I remember, like, the last day of class, he called me over to his desk and he asked me, what I was doing after graduation. I told him I was going to Touche Ross and that someday I wanted to teach accounting. I didn't know that Ron was the chair of the business department at Community College of Allegheny County. And what Ron told me at that time, he said, if you pass the CPA exam, I'll hire you, right? And you can teach accounting at CCAC as an adjunct professor. I started teaching for CCAC in the fall of 1992. So why did Ron dangle that carrot in front of me? Was he perhaps perspective taking about the difficulty for an African-American male to get a job teaching, particularly in higher education, and that he was able to level the playing field? I choose to believe that my position coach, Mr. Gavin, and Ron Halsack, and other important people who I've known throughout my professional career, decided to assist me with seizing opportunities by seeing the world through my eyes, by perspective taking. I don't think it's a stretch to assume that most of my central brethren participating in this discussion are white males. Some, perhaps many of you, might be able, right, to change someone's life by leveling the playing field through perspective taking. All right, so what's perspective taking? Let's start this learning process, right, about perspective taking by listening to a conversation between Gary and Heather.
I was hoping that your guest can help me change my mind about some things. I'm a white male and I am prejudiced. And the reason it is something I wasn't taught, but it's kind of something that I learned. When I open up the papers, I get very discouraged at what young black males are doing to each other. And the crime rates. I understand that they live in an environment with a lot of drugs. You have to get money for drugs, and it's a deep issue that goes beyond that. But when I have these different fears, and I don't want my fears to come true, so I try to avoid that. And I come off as being prejudiced, but I just have fears. I don't like to be forced to like people. I like to be led to like people through example. And what can I do to change, to be a better American?
Heather McKee.
Thank you so much for being honest and for opening up this conversation, because it's simply one of the most important ones we have to have in this country. We are not a country that is united because we are all one racial group that all descended from one tribe in one community. That is actually, I think, what makes this country beautiful, but it's our challenge. We are the most multiracial, multi-ethnic, wealthy democracy in the world. And so asking the question you asked, how do I get over my fears and my prejudices, is the question that all of us, and I will say people of all races and ethnicities and backgrounds, hold these fears and prejudices. Most of them are actually unconscious, right? You'll say to yourself, I'm not prejudiced, but of course we all have them. And so your ability to just say, this is what I have these fears and prejudices, and I want to get over them, is one of the most powerful things that we can do right now at this moment in our history. So thank you. So what can you do? Get to know Black families who are not all, and not even any majority, are involved in crime and gangs. Turn off the news at night, because we know from, sorry, Greta, keep the news open in the morning. But
we're not delivering the news, so it's fine.
Because we know that actually nightly news and many media markets that have been studied actually overrepresents African American crime and underrepresents crimes that happen by white people. Join a church if you are a religious person that is a Black church or a church that is interracial. Start to read about the history of the African American community in this country. Foster conversation in your family and in your neighborhood where you're asking exactly those kinds of questions. This fear of communities that we do not live near. We are still a very, very segregated country. Millions of white Americans live in places where they rarely see anyone of a different race. This fear and set of ideas that we only get from the worst possible news, it's tearing us apart. And we know that in order to be our name means the people of the nation, demos. In order to be a demos that is united across lines of race and class and gender and age, we have to foster relationships. We have to get to know who one another actually is. And we are always, I think, as Americans, surprised when we build relationships across race.
Let's get in Laneda.
So we have to know, right, who the other person is, right? Did you notice in that video, right, in that clip, that conversation, that was in 2016, right? And everything that both folks were talking about, Gary and Heather's, is still applicable to today, right? And that's not that big of a surprise, but it's just a point worth noting in my opinion. So there's numerous race-related issues that we could discuss about the conversation between Gary and Heather, and Heather's response, right? So I want to focus on three aspects of the conversation: how Gary said what he said, right, and how it made Heather feel; how Heather listened, felt, if you could sense how she was feeling, right, as she responded to Gary, and the outcomes of the conversation, right? But before we get into any of that, I just want you to take a minute and just reflect to yourself. Not even a minute, just a few seconds. Just reflect to yourself, like, what about that conversation resonated with you, and how did it resonate with you? Was it one or two or three things that captured your attention? Why do you think it resonated with you, right? So go ahead and do that for just 15, 20 seconds. Okay, all right. So when you look at this slide on your screen, what do you see? Do you see a chalice with the words, how we understand what others think, believe, feel, and want? Those words are the essence of perspective taking. When you look at the slide, do you see two faces looking at each other? If you didn't, right, do you see the faces now? I'm sure some of you, right, only saw the chalice, and some of you saw the chalice and the faces. So we all see things differently, and we all come to understand things differently over the course of time, hopefully, right? But we particularly see things in different ways, right? Particularly when the difference is very salient. In other words, if it relates to skin color. So how do we begin to understand? How do we build these relationships, right? Okay. How do we understand what each other thinks, believes, feels, and wants, right? We can start, right, by listening to each other, to hear the fears, to hear the experiences, and the environments, right, in which those experiences, right, take place, right? And how those experiences influence the way we might act and value each other. Okay. Sometimes what we're going to hear, right, and witness challenges us. Sometimes it scares us, sometimes it confounds us, right? So in Gary, right, speaking to Heather, right, how did he speak to her that moved her to step outside of her comfort zone, right? Her fears, right, about what Gary was communicating to her, right? So Gary was authentic in his case for requesting help to change, right? As a result, Gary and Heather remain friends, right, to this day, engaged in healthy and complex conversations to improve their relationship, right? And probably more importantly, his relationship with others who are different from him, okay? After the initial call with Gary, Heather acknowledged being empathetic, right? While feeling fear herself, okay? That was the first step for her towards perspective taking, right? And starting the long journey of bonding with Gary. So, how do the academics define perspective taking? Let's take a look at this slide. Well, folks, there's a lot of information on this slide. Just take a few seconds to absorb it in the content. I want you to note that there's three aspects of perspective taking: cognitive, affective, and appraisal. So just take a few seconds to absorb it. So what I want you to take away from this slide is that in the context of improving relationships between people, no matter what the issue, having positive interactions can build trust over time, right? And allow for what they call fierce conversations to occur, particularly about race. So these positive interactions that we need to have can often be derived from a deeper understanding, right, of the other person, why they think, feel, behave the way they do. Okay. Now, in the cognitive dimension of perspective taking, you think deeply about what it might be like to be the other person, to imagine what they feel like as they experience certain events or circumstances in their life, particularly those events that are devaluing to their esteem, right, their identity. The psychologists call this cognitive process self-other overlap. And research studies have validated that when cognitive perspective taking occurs in an earnest way, it lowers one's prejudice, right, and bias towards others. All right, so that's enough of the academic talk. Let's look at a great practical example of an invitation to perspective take. Take a few seconds to read this letter. So as alumni, do you remember when you received this letter from Brother Tony, right? How did you appraise the event concerning George Floyd? How did that event affect you? What do you think about that event and other events that followed? Now imagine, right, you're African American and revisit these same questions. Frankly and honestly, you shouldn't have immediate answers, right? Just deep thoughts. And perhaps those thoughts, right, will last for a day, right? Maybe for a couple of days, maybe for a month, maybe for a couple of months, maybe for a year, but hopefully for a lifetime, right? Because this is what the process of perspective taking should be for all of us, so that the appropriate answers to these questions come to light over time, as we continue to work together to improve our relationships with others. You see these pink shaded words, right? Right. That's perspective taking. Those are some of the key elements, right? Feeling, trying to feel what others feel, right? Okay, and thinking about those feelings and trying to just, imagine what is it like to be that person experiencing what they experience, okay? And hopefully, right, how does that affect me and how I might want to change the way I behave, right? Or change the way I see the world through their eyes, okay? All right, let's move on. So when does perspective taking not work, right? So I believe Gary had a lot of courage to call a national TV show, admit he's prejudiced, and ask, what can I do to change? Right. I think his character was changed for the better as soon as he made that phone call, right? It's hard to earnestly engage in perspective taking if you have low self-esteem, right? Because other issues in life, they might prevent you, right, from understanding another person's situations or concerns, okay? So what I want you to take away from this slide in particular is that, perspective taking has its limits, right? It might be ineffective, right, when we don't have our own life together, our own stuff together, right? When we need to work on understanding why we think, feel, and behave the way we do, before we try to understand another person. All right. So the promise of perspective taking, we've got some unanswered questions, right? So one question was, why does a guy start and the other doesn't if they're both equal in ability? So here's the answer. As an adult with 55 years of life under my belt, I'm praying for many more because I want to keep on perspective taking. This is not the question to be answered. The real question is, regardless of ability, how do we level the playing field so that one's ability can reach its full potential? Because if we create space for ability to develop, we create pathways to success that overcome life's obstacles. We create space when we perspective take. When we take on that mental task of genuinely trying to see the world through another's eyes, to become that person as cognitively as possible. And as I mentioned before, research confirms that when members of the majority group perspective take on members from marginalized groups, there is a reduction in bias, prejudice, and stereotyping. So in other words, to put it where the goats can get it, when our white brothers and sisters perspective take on our brothers and sisters of color, when young people perspective take on older people, when privileged people perspective take on disadvantaged people, social bonding increases and interpersonal relationships improve. I want to say one last thing about the unanswered question. That discussion between my coach and I was an indelible moment for me. But that experience, although important to me, it pales in comparison to the countless devaluing experiences of women in the workplaces and other spaces in which we interact. It pales in comparison, right, to those devaluing experiences that result in loss of life. People being killed in churches, right? What happened in Atlanta yesterday, where people lost their lives, right, apparently due to their racial ethnic background. So I hope that you'll join me, right, in incorporating perspective taking as an everyday habit so that collectively we can create spaces for everyone's ability to flourish, right? And as a result, people feel valued and respected and safe. So I can't let you go without being a real educator and give you some homework, right? If you're ever interested in learning a little bit more about perspective taking, you can go to this particular link, and I guess maybe we could send out the actual website address where you can take this particular, you can view this particular video. And there's a perspective taking quiz that an author I really like, a researcher, Michelle Williams, does a lot of work on perspective taking. She has like a 2-3 minute perspective taking quiz, right, where you can get a sense for how well you might perspective take, and then other resources that you can use. So last but not least, it's good to be a perspective taker, but more importantly, to be a perspective doer. So I want to thank you for listening to me. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Scott. What a tremendous and fine presentation. We really appreciate you taking time to be with us here today and share some of your experiences and your thoughts and your knowledge. That is all the time that we have for today's session. I hope that you will join us again at some point in the future for our upcoming virtual events in April. Our next Alumni Mass Remembrance will take place on Thursday, April 8th. The 31st Annual Viking Victory Auction will take place virtually this year on April 24th. The event will be chaired by Evan and Holly Frazier, and we'll be inducting Bill Hillgrove as our newest member of the Central Catholic Hall of Fame. We do have an incredible discussion lined up for next month for the speaker series as well. We're in the process of working out those details, and information will be available soon. Once again, I'd like to thank Dr. Scott for joining us and being with us here today. For all those at home viewing, thank you for taking time out to be with us. This recording of this video will be posted on our YouTube channel shortly. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their afternoon. St. John Baptist de La Salle, pray for us. Live Jesus in our hearts forever. Thanks, Dr. Scott.
Bye-bye.